Considerations on Marx's Base and Superstructure. Stephen B. Smith, Yale University. In this paper the author examines and criticizes three theses concerning Marx's base and superstructure. The fundamentalist thesis regards base and superstructure as externally or causally connected, the internal relatedness thesis sees them as mutually determining or dialectically related, and the overdetermination thesis attempts to conceptualize some degree of autonomy for the superstructure while still according a determination in the last instance to the base. The author concludes with some remarks concerning the appropriateness of this base and superstructure model for the conduct of social inquiry. This paper will be devoted to examining the character of various second-order accounts of Marx's base and superstructure model of society. The first position to be referred to will be the economistic version of this model, in which the productive forces of society are seen as directly determining all the other spheres of social, political, and cultural life. The fundamentist thesis, as this is called, amounts to a form of technological determinism defended by proponents of orthodox Marxism, of which G. A. Cohen's recent study is perhaps the most prominent example. The second position to be considered is that which regards base and superstructure not as externally or causally connected but as mutually determining attributes of the same social totality. The internal relatedness thesis, so named by Bertel Oilman, has been adopted by a variety of Marxist theorists such as Luc-C.S., Gramsci, and Raymond Williams to indicate a more complex, multifaceted reciprocal causality between base and superstructure. And the third position is that developed by Louis Althusser, who has tried to bridge the gap between the first two by suggesting that while the productive forces of society remain determinant in the last instance, this is still compatible with a considerable degree of autonomy for the superstructure. The twin principles of determination in the last instance by the base and the relative autonomy of the superstructure amount to the overdetermination thesis, which we shall encounter later on. I would like to thank Gary Freeman as well as the anonymous readers for the SSO for their comments on earlier versions of this paper. Editor's note: reviewers were Robert Grafstein, Richard McCaig, and John Walton. Marx's Base and Superstructure 941. My chief aim in this paper, then, will be to examine each of these three theses in order to reveal certain tensions and ambiguities that exist both within and between them. This is not to suggest either that these three theses exhaust all the possible alternatives or that these ambiguities demonstrate the inadequacy of the overall model. Rather, my suggestion is that Marx's base and superstructure is an intellectual proteus capable of a number of possibly conflicting constructions that pull in different directions. Furthermore, I will try to suggest that this protean quality is not a sign of the weakness of the model, but is rather a function of Marx's sense of the complexity of the historical manifold. I will conclude with a few remarks concerning the appropriateness of Marx's base and superstructure model for the conduct of social inquiry generally. The fundamentalist thesis. The first thesis I would like to examine is the fundamentalist version of the base and superstructure model. The best-known formulation of this thesis occurs in the 1859 preface to Marx's contribution to the Critique of Poetical Economy, the crucial passage of which runs as follows: in the social production of their life, men enter into definite relations that are indispensable and independent of their will, relations of production which correspond to a definite stage of development of their material productive forces. The sum total of these relations of production constitutes the economic structure of society, the real foundation, on which rises a legal and political superstructure and to which correspond definite forms of social consciousness. The mode of production of material life conditions the social, political, and intellectual life process in general. It is not the consciousness of men that determines their being, but, on the contrary, their social being that determines their consciousness. The fundamentalist thesis appears to rest on at least three presuppositions. The first is that every society is divided into different levels or strata that can be organized hierarchically in the following order: forces of production, relations of production or the economic structure, the legal and political superstructure, and forms of social consciousness. The second presupposition is that processes in any of the higher subsystems are determined in the sense of direct causal dependence by the subsystems below them and ultimately by the forces of production. And the third presupposition is that this causal determination is entirely one-way or unidirectional, such that the base determines the superstructure and not vice versa. These three presuppositions taken together amount to a form of technological determinism, perhaps most commonly associated with the names of Plekhanov, Koski, and Bukharin. It is noteworthy that not even the most orthodox defenders of the fundamentalist thesis have been able to defend it consistently. This is due to the phrase cited is from Wells. 942 Social Science Quarterly. The difficulty of isolating the technological base as a cause independent of its effects. Consequently, many Marxists have been led to argue that there is some kind of interaction or mutual conditioning between base and superstructure, or that the base only asserts itself in the last instance. To assert that the forces of production determine the relations of production assumes that one factor X can be isolated from another factor Y that can be seen to follow from it sequentially or temporally. These forces then become an independent variable that can be used to explain but cannot be explained by other non-economic factors. The problem here stems from the difficulty of isolating one factor or element from the totality of social conditions in which it is found and then elevating it to the cause separable from those conditions. Indeed, it is difficult to conceive, much less to observe, the forces of production as a cause apart from the legal, moral, and political relationships among men. Obviously, the fundamentalist thesis depends for its validity on how we understand the determinative influence of the productive forces. It should be mentioned that Marx's normal word for determine, which derives from the Latin determinare and which has the connotation of setting bounds or setting limits, is bedingen or bestimen. Important to this understanding of causality is also the idea of externality, that is, some independently specifiable agency, in this case the productive forces, that can control or decide the outcome of a process or action apart from the other contributors to that process. It is in this sense of an external or independently specifiable cause that the productive forces are said to block or select out all features of the superstructure that do not correspond or comply with it. The forces of production, then, may be said to set limits to what kinds of social relations are compatible with their stage of development. The force of the term cause must be understood here in a quasi-functional sense. Societies get the superstructures they do because what does not comply with or correspond to the given stage in the development of productive forces has already been blocked out as inappropriate, and what has already been blocked out as inappropriate obviously did not comply. As Marx himself was fond of saying, Don Quixote long ago paid the penalty for wrongly imagining that knight-errantry was compatible with all economic forms of society. This form of technological determinism, with its insistence upon the absolute primacy of productive forces over productive relations and bases over superstructures, has been given renewed impetus recently, due largely to G.A. Cohen's influential carry Marxist theory of I-history. More thoroughly than any previous interpreter, Cohen has put forward a sophisticated defense of the dependence of the economic structure and superstructure on the technological apparatus of society. He said, to say that being determines consciousness, means at least in part, the character of the leading ideas of a society is explained by their propensity, in virtue of that character, to sustain the structure of economic roles called for by the productive forces. His case for the causal primacy of the productive forces rests upon two assertions about human nature in general and one observation. Marx's Base and Superstructure 943 about the empirical conditions in which human beings typically find themselves. The two assertions are first that human beings are somewhat rational, and second that they can use their rationality to improve materially their situations. The observation is that the situations in which most of us find ourselves is one dominated by material scarcity, that is, one that requires material improvement. The premise here is that there is a natural tendency grounded in the conditions of human rationality or intelligence as such, and independent of social and historical circumstances, to expand and improve upon the productive forces in order to conquer the conditions of scarcity. It is important to note that productive forces are conceived here narrowly to include only the technical forces of production. Since Cohen believes that productive forces have a tendency to expand in the normal run of things, at any given stage of their development only those social relations will obtain that serve to facilitate the further improvement of the technological substratum of society. It is this extra-social or supra-historical principle of technology around which the whole of society is constrained to adjust that constitutes for Cohen the core of Marx's teaching. It is not entirely clear from Cohen's analysis why he ascribed pride of place to technology and not rationality. Cne imagines that this would conflict with his materialism, which regards the content of reason as determined by non-rational material forces, namely, conditions of scarcity. In order to make good this claim, Cohen pointed to a number of passages from Capital and the Grundrisse in which Marx speaks of the technological and material base as a sort of free cause distinct from the social and historical forms which it helps to determine. Cohen wrote, "We are arguing that the familiar distinction between forces and relations of production is, in Marx, one of a set of contrasts between nature and society." Commentators have failed to remark how often he uses material as the antonym of social, and how what is described as material also counts as the content of some form. The upshot of these oppositions and identifications is that the matter or content of society is nature, whose form is the social form. It has been suggested that this distinction between natural and material on the one side and social and historical on the other is a false one because the passages coincided in support of it are used by Marx not to defend but to attack this abstraction. Leaving aside the difficulty of attempting to abstract some kind of law immanent within history, my point is that by conceiving the productive forces as narrowly as he does, Cohen's argument ends by giving more weight to the technological base than it can be made to bear. Technique may, of course, be analytically separated from social relations and other moments of the superstructure, but then to assume that this analytical distinction refers to two substantively separate objects or regions of activity in the physical world is to fall prey to the type of reification so often decried by Marxist theoreticians themselves. Indeed, it is just this fear of confusing our epistemological categories with ontological ones that has 944 Social Science Quarterly led many Marxists to reject the whole base and superstructure formulation as misleading. The fact is that we never find the forces of production existing outside of specific social relations, and in reality the two overlap to a considerable extent. We need only think how science functions not as a derivative but as a cause of developments in economic technique to show how there is a considerable degree of overlap or multiple countings between base and superstructure. For all of the analytical sophistication of the fundamentalist thesis, its modern proponents do not escape the pitfalls that vitiated the older formulations. In identifying the forces of production with the natural or material substratum in contrast to the social and historical forms of existence, Cohen ends by abstracting one feature of the social whole and turning it into a transcendent principle responsible for the development of all the others. We must not mistake technique, which is at best analytically prior, with the actual movement of history. The result, then, of Cohen's technological determinism is that it is incapable of accounting for how technique changes except by positing it as a sort of free cause separate from the historical manifold. The conclusion we reach is that productive forces do not comprise a self-subsistent world that can be separated from other regions of activity such as consumption, distribution, and exchange, much less from the various modes of social cooperation, and from the application and development of certain bodies of social knowledge. These processes are not distinct and separable entities, but are mutually conditioning features of the same social whole. This is not to say that these categories cannot be isolated and described for purposes of analysis, but then to think that they refer to separate compartments of real life is to commit a category mistake. The chief weakness, then, of the fundamentalist thesis is not that it simplifies history, which is always richer and more complex than any theory can represent it as being. It is that it mistakes the theory for the object it seeks to explain. The internal relatedness thesis. The second thesis I would like to consider seeks to avoid the inadequacies of the first by focusing not on causal connections but on the internal relatedness of social practices within the same organic totality. The virtue of the internal relatedness thesis, as I shall refer to it, is that it refuses to treat the various levels, instances, or factors of a social formation as constituting more or less self-enclosed or regionally separated spheres of activity. No matter how insistent adherents of the fundamentalist thesis may be about the interaction of base and superstructure, it cannot avoid, as I have tried to show, the fragmentation and reification of reality by treating the categories of thought as though they were categories of the world. What distinguishes the internal relatedness thesis is, then, that it regards productive forces not as causes that bring about changes in other non-economic variables, but as Spinozistic attributes which coexist alongside one another as parts of a larger whole or totality. The phrase cited is from Lukács. Marx's Base and Superstructure 945. The language of totality has now become common and is in many respects preferable to the layered notion of a base and a consequent superstructure. The concept of totality was introduced into the Marxist idiom by Lukács, who had taken it originally from Hegel. The primary feature of this category is that it consists of a complex network of interlocking parts in which everything is related to everything else such that there are no proper subsets unrelated to the rest of the whole. In other words, there is an active process of mediation or an interaction of forces that cannot simply be regarded as miscellaneous or contemporaneous. The concept of totality will no doubt be familiar to social scientists working within the systems approach, in which the underlying idea is that the parts of the social whole all work together to bring about some end state such as the maintenance of the variables of the system. These variables are not isolated or discrete factors which are logically independent of others, but are rather bound together by bonds of mutual and irreducible interdependence, such that to alter one relation is to alter the whole of which that relation is a part. Perhaps the most sustained treatment of this thesis can be found in Bertel Oilman's book Alienation, which presents Marxism as an all-inclusive philosophy of social relations. According to this thesis, since the basic elements of reality are not separately identifiable things but networks of relations, it follows that it is extraordinarily difficult to prohibit every relation from potentially spilling over into and even becoming every other relation. This view of social relations is often called dialectical inasmuch as it sees not only things but our mental perceptions of them as radiating outward in all different directions. As such, both relations and their meanings are almost impossible to pin down. Oilman cited Pareto's dictum that Marx's words are like bats, one can see in them both birds and mice, to underscore Marx's peculiar use of terms. It is, then, both the interaction within both base and superstructure as well as the interaction between them that constitutes Marx's true meaning. This, and not technological determinism, Oilman has confidently asserted, is the conception of history illustrated in Marx's detailed discussions of political and social phenomena. Oilman adduced 4 reasons for ascribing the internal relatedness thesis to Marx, 2 of which are of interest to us. The first is based on statements that Marx explicitly made, indicating that he viewed things as intelligible only in terms of their relations to other things. Thus, in the methodological introduction to the Grundrisse, Marx berated the political economists for treating production, consumption, and distribution abstractly, that is, as self-contained spheres which can be studied in and of themselves. The conclusion we reach, he wrote, is not that production, distribution, exchange, and consumption are identical, but that they all form the members of a totality, distinctions within a unity. And similarly he wrote that it is not the primacy of economic motives in historical explanation that constitutes the decisive difference between Marxism and bourgeois thought, but the point of view of the totality. The viability of the systems approach has been recently reasserted by Easton. For a powerful critique of this approach, see Berry. 946 Social Science Quarterly. A change in any one relation or set of relations is bound to bring about changes in all the others. A change in distribution changes production. Mutual interaction takes place between the different moments. This, Marx concluded, is the case with every organ/credo/e. There are other passages where Marx seems unwilling to limit the internal relatedness thesis to human phenomena alone and appears to accord it the status of a more general cosmological theory encompassing the whole of organic nature. Registered in a passage from the early economic and philosophic manuscripts we read, "The sun is an object, a necessary and life-assuring object, for the plant, just as the plant is an object for the sun, an expression of the sun's life-giving power and objective essential powers." In other words, the connection between two objects which most of us would treat in causal terms is understood here as an expression of what each naturally is. As natural objects, Oilman wrote, the sun and the plant have their nature outside themselves, such that the relation between them is conceived as appertaining to each, and is part of the full meaning conveyed by their respective concepts. The second reason of interest that Oilman felt justified in ascribing this thesis to Marx is because not to do so would have required a total break with the philosophical tradition in which he was nourished. Hegel, Leibniz, and Spinoza had all sought for the meanings of things and/or of the terms which characterize them in their relations inside the whole. This is, at the very least, a curious statement to make. In the first place, the internal relations theories of Hegel, Leibniz, and Spinoza are all very different from one another and have been used to support a variety of very different positions. And second, while it is true that Marx read and studied the works of the various writers that Oilman cited, it is also true that he rejected many of their doctrines and ways of thinking. Thus, to attempt to impute some positive influence on the ground that this was the particular intellectual tradition on which Marx was nourished proves nothing. There is both a strong and a weak sense in which we can take the internal relatedness thesis. The extreme version is that relations are internal, that is, that all relations are one of logical entailment and not of causal connectedness. This, it is often argued, was Hegel's view of the totality, which has certainly found resonance in the works of Lukács and the Frankfurt School with their rejection of science and causal reasoning. Science is, on this view, a part of the superstructure and as such reveals an absolute homogeneity of nature with the development of the productive forces. The problem here is that if we believe everything to be related to everything else by bonds of logical entailment, it is difficult to know how we could account for the AP. That Marx held to something like a dialectics of nature has been challenged by Thomas. In particular, Spinoza has been used by Althusser as an anti-Hegel, see Althusser. For a good critique of this view, see Coletti and Althusser and Balibar. Marx's Base and Superstructure 947 Appearance of contradiction or dysfunction between things. By emphasizing the internal solidarity between the base and superstructure, proponents of the internal relatedness thesis have attributed to it a solidity and rational efficiency that seems to preclude even the possibility of change, a weakness it also shares with the system's approach. This dialectical vision whereby everything is potentially everything else may be intuitively or poetically appealing, but, taken literally, it would amount to a denial that there is any process of determination going on. If we say, for instance, that society is composed of a large number of factors that overlap and crisscross in a variety of complicated ways, we would be withdrawing from the claim that we can define a separable determining factor distinct from what it is supposed to determine. The productive forces would thus lose whatever position of privilege they may have had within Marxism. To his credit, Kuhlmann withdrew from this extreme version of the internal relatedness thesis and claimed that his position is not incompatible with the ascription of causal powers to the base. On the basis of the philosophy of internal relations, the mutual dependence of all elements in the world is conceived of in terms of a constant, multifaceted interaction. This does not rule out causal relationships, where one element or structure or event is primarily responsible for a change in the form or function of others, but simply qualifies them. The all-embracing version of the internal relatedness thesis is clearly false. While it is possible to distinguish unidirectional, linear conceptions of causation from the sorts of complex, multifaceted, reciprocal relations, it would be wrong to regard these as two incompatible alternatives. To say that the various organs of the body form a complex interlocking whole does not prohibit us from also saying that it is the heart that causes the blood to flow. Oilman tried to reconcile these alternatives by suggesting, plausibly in my view, that it depends upon context as to whether the parts of a whole are regarded as internally related or causally connected. Whenever a causal claim is made, the interactive context limits the possibilities of what is being asserted and what, apparently, is being denied. Some relations are obviously highly interactive or mutually supporting, such as that between a husband and a wife, master and slave, labor and capital, so that to alter one term of the relation is to alter the relation as a whole. The relations separated by vast stretches of time and space are only loosely related if at all. Again, it all depends on context. There is a weaker version of this thesis that I want only to mention in passing. By weaker I do not mean that is poorly or weakly reasoned, but that its claims are less ambitious and is, therefore, likely to be defensible if any version is. This is the view, sometimes associated with Gramsci's theory of hegemony, that while societies consist of a complex of interlocking practices, these practices are arranged in a hierarchical pattern of domination and subordination, some being more important than others. This conception of the totality as a hierarchy of practices is able to retain the causal primacy of the productive forces, yet see in the spheres of politics, law, and culture something more than a mere superstructure. These become basic to the social formation itself and related to a much 948 social science quartieri wider area of reality than the narrow segregation of discrete economic, social, and political spheres of activity would suggest. This view of the social totality is a hierarchy of unequal relations of subordination and superordination is also closely akin to the Althusserian theory of overdetermination, which is the third thesis I would now like to consider. The overdetermination thesis. The third model of base and superstructure relations put forward by Ejus Althusser and his school is the overdetermination thesis, which is in a sense a combination of both the fundamentalist and the internal relatedness theses we have already examined. Althusser's is one that tries to retain the notion of society as constituted of distinct and regionally separated levels or instances, of which 3 or 4 are discernible: the economic, political, ideological, and theoretical. Taken together, these instances constitute the overall social formation, which is determined by more than the economy alone but by the combination of articulation of the various subsystems within the whole. But even as Althusser recognized the reciprocal or mutually determining relationship between base and superstructure in which the latter manages to enjoy a considerable degree of autonomy, he continued to accord a special role to the economy described as determination in the last instance. Althusser's overdetermination thesis is an attack upon both orthodox Marxian economism or technologism on the one hand and the Hegelian expressive totality on the other. Accordingly, he attributed a special importance to the older Engels's qualification of his and Marx's earlier reductionism, stating that neither he nor Marx had ever claimed that the economic element is the only determining one, and went on to suggest that those who do have transformed the substantive principles of historical materialism into a meaningless, abstract, senseless phrase. Nonetheless, Engels was willing to admit that he and Marx were partly to blame for the fact that the younger people sometimes lay more stress on the economic side than is due it, but attributed this to the heat of debate when there was not always the time or place to develop the other elements involved in the interaction. What Engels' self-criticism claimed is the importance of other factors which are not purely economic, and that he and Marx knew the limits of technological determinism all along. Unfortunately, what Engels put forward here when he said that economic conditions are only ultimately determinant is an eclectic formula that tells us almost nothing. The question remains that if the forces of production do not solely or uniquely determine the character of a society, when Engels said determine, what, then, did he mean? And if the determination in the last instance by the base is compatible with the relative autonomy of the superstructure, what does the qualifier relative add? It certainly does not tell us whether the productive forces are to lose their hitherto privileged place within the Marxian canon, and if they do, how Marxism is to be distinguished from its chief competitor, liberal pluralism. This is the problem which Althusser hopes to resolve through the use of the Marx's base and superstructure 949 concept of structural causality or overdetermination, the concept of overdetermination is taken over by Althusser from Freudian psychoanalytic theory. In technical terms, it means that more influences produce an event than are necessary to explain it. Here too this seems similar to the systems theory notion of equifinality, the idea that any particular effect may be produced by a number of different causes and complexes of causal relations. It is in this sense of multiple sources of determination that converge on a single end that the term has been used by the classical scholar E.R. Dodds to describe the Herodotean view of history. While history is, for Herodotus, on one level the outcome of human acts and purposes, it is, on another, the work of divine /iantos or the jealousy of the gods working in and through human deeds. A similar use of the term is also found in the work of the anthropologist E. Evans Pritchard, who told us that among the Ozanda belief in death from natural causes and belief in death from magic or witchcraft do not necessarily exclude one another. Perhaps the best definition of overdetermination known to me, however, is that of a man who asks his neighbor for the return of his lawnmower and is told in reply, "I never borrowed your lawnmower, and besides I'm not finished with it yet, and what's more it's such a miserable excuse for a lawnmower that you shouldn't want it back anyway." Registered Althusser used the overdetermination thesis in order to interpret Marx's theory of contradiction. In the fundamentalist version, Marx had argued that the contradiction between productive forces and the social relations of production is the source of tension that eventually produces change. This contradiction between the forces and relations of production is regarded as a law immanent within history, abstracted from the wealth of diverse events that it is said uniquely to determine. Althusser by contrast has tried to suggest that contradictions inherent in the material base are not the only ones but are supplemented by contradictions inherent in the superstructure as well, each of which has its own specific power of determination. Following Lenin, he referred to this as the law of uneven development. The whole thus appears as a unity of contradictions whose principal aspect is the economy, but which is overdetermined in the process by key elements of the superstructure. If a vast accumulation of contradictions comes into play in the same court, some of which are radically heterogeneous of different origins, different sense, different levels and points of application, but which nevertheless merge into a ruptural unity, we can no longer talk of the sole, unique power of the general contradiction. The difficulty with this concept appears when we have to organize this vast accumulation of contradictions into a unified explanation. Althusser stressed that the key to historical transformation depends upon the cumulative buildup of general contradictions which leads to the collapse. In some countries one particular constellation or conjuncture of events will prove explosive, and in other countries quite a different mix will be required. I owe this example to Bernard Silbermann. 950 Social Science Quarterly Eichel explanation is satisfied once every aspect of the conjuncture is described in full. Thus Althusser made much of Lenin's statements about the unique configuration of events that made possible the October Revolution of 1917. On the basis of this testimony, a number of seemingly unrelated events, the outbreak of the war, the collapse of Tsarism, the availability of Lenin and the Bolshevik Party, all converged on the same end. Being the weakest link in the chain of advanced countries, Russia combined just those elements in such a way as to make it ripe for revolution. The problem here is that Althusser has not attempted to connect or relate any of these historical overdeterminations into any kind of pattern, so that they can scarcely be used as evidence for the theory he might wish to propound. It must be explained that Althusser, in a laudable effort to get away from fundamentalism, was much more concerned with the uniqueness of events and consequently stressed the multiple sources of determination. History is for him contingent in Bernal's term, or configurational, as G. Simpson has described it, that is, a sequence of real, individual but interrelated events. One consequence of this theory is that it denies the applicability of any general or covering law to explain the emergence of the causes of social upheaval, since every event is unique, the outcome of different configurations of local circumstances that will never appear in the same form again. Althusser is not providing us with law-like explanations, but is rather telling us why all such explanations are impossible. There are no general criteria to show why this vast accumulation of Contradictions led in some places to socialism, in others to fascism, and in others still to the continued survival of liberal capitalism. All we are told is that these alternatives appeared in those societies that were ripe for these respective outcomes. At best, this allows us to retrodict causes from results rather than to predict the likely outcome of events in the future. It is important to note exactly what this interpretation of revolution is intended to put forward and what it is intended to forestall. Since breaks in historical continuity are not predictable and obey no law, it follows that a Lenin or any architect of social change can never have a reliable blueprint for political action. As A. 0. Hirschman has put it, not only is each house he builds different from any other that was built before, but it also necessarily uses new construction materials and even experiments with untested principles of stress and structure. In other words, there are no general laws in history around which we can form statistical regularities and generalizations which can then be used for the control and manipulation of events. Since history is overdetermined or configurational, any so-called laws are almost always open to exceptions. What we get, then, is an understanding of revolutions as highly improbable complexes of events that will never occur in the same way again, that is, a plea for historical uniqueness. If a revolution breaks out, then the general nexus of contradictions must have reached the point of combustion or rupture, but there is no telling beforehand what particular constellation of factors will lead up to the crisis. Revolutionary. Marx's base and superstructure 951 situations, then, can only be understood retrospectively. Like Hegel's Owl of Minerva, historical explanation only takes place with the falling of the dusk. The main problem with the overdetermination thesis turns on just how much autonomy Althusser intends to cede to the superstructure. What gave the fundamentalist thesis its bite was the weight it gave to one specific set of factors in the explanation of social change. But Althusser's reformulation of this theory leads to an almost equal weighting of both structural and superstructural factors. Because everything contributes to the process of change, we cannot abstract certain features from a situation and rank them in some relative order of importance. Rather, we must rest content with a form of descriptive empiricism in which both base and superstructure are accorded more or less equal status. The ultimate impact of this multi-causal, overdetermined model is, then, to replace the fundamentalist emphasis upon the causal primacy of the productive forces with a species of methodological pluralism or individualism. Althusser denied, however, that the concept of overdetermination necessarily commits him to a pluralist or descriptivist analysis. The autonomy of the superstructure, he asserted, is only relative, not absolute, and does not exclude the primacy of the base in the last instance. But while the productive base is the determinant instance, it is not necessarily the dominant one. For example, in European countries of the Middle Ages, religious relations appeared to dominate. And in the types of primitive societies studied by Levi Strauss, kinship relations appear as dominant. In neither case, though, does this contradict the principle that economic relations are still determinant. Balibar explained this paradox thus: in different societal structures, the economic is the determinant in that it determines those moments of the social structure which occupy the determining place. This is an example, according to Balibar, of structural causality in contrast to both mechanical causation, the reduction of all members of the totality to the technological or material base, and Hegelian organicism or internal relatedness which ends by equalizing everything. In place of both these, Althusser adopted the principle of the hierarchical organization of society divided into determinant, dominant, and subordinate instances, each with its own degree of specific effectivity. For all his attempts to resolve these difficulties, the overdetermination thesis is at once both too strong and too weak. It is too strong inasmuch as it is asserted as some sort of unequivocal principle of explanation. For if the economic is determinant even if only in the last instance, then the autonomy of the superstructure automatically becomes vitiated. But if the relative autonomy of the superstructure is taken as the decisive feature, then the causal primacy of the productive forces loses its place. It seems that when pushed to their limits one or the other side has to give, and if it is the economy that ultimately asserts itself, why then bother with the autonomy claim at all? In the final analysis, Althusser's overdetermination thesis does not escape, but rather reproduces the problems of the two accounts we have already examined. 952 Social Science Quartieri. It should be said as a final word of explanation that Althusser was not unaware of the ambiguity of the two principles of determination in the last instance by the base and the relative autonomy of the superstructure, and referred to these as the two ends of the chain. Whether he has succeeded in joining these ends or merely calling our attention to them is a matter left unresolved in his work. At the very least, these principles remain obscure, hovering, as Anthony Giddens has put it, between a metaphysical dogma on the one hand, and an interpretation that comes uncomfortably close to a sort of pluralist functionalism on the other. Conclusion. There are two conclusions I would like to draw from the foregoing account of Marx's base and superstructure model of society, one positive and the other cautionary. In the first piece, I hope to have demonstrated that this model admits of no one definitive interpretation, but rather points simultaneously in a number of different directions. It should be obvious, I hope, that no one of these variations of the base and superstructure theme can be said to be simply correct. All three variations on this theme exist side by side within Marx's writings, and sometimes even within the same text. The fact that he did not see fit to separate them does not lead me to conclude that he was conceptually confused or contradictory. It indicates rather that he was concerned to develop different explanatory models to account for different sorts of social and political phenomena. That at least three such accounts are clearly discernible in his writings is not a mark of confusion, but on the contrary, of a mind fully attuned to the actual complexities of historical experience. What this suggests is, then, not that Marx presented a single determinate or even causal theory of social change which can then be held up as the doctrinal core of historical materialism. He has instead provided us with a number of illuminating suggestions focusing on the most universal features of societies and indicating a variety of ways in which the historian or social scientist might usefully go about pursuing his craft. Second, however, we must beware of regarding history in terms of bases, superstructures, and the like held together either by networks of causal forces or by relations of logical entailment if this is intended as a way of eliminating human agency from social analysis. Indeed, the concept of agency restores the key emphasis to any social theory that can be accounted as adequate. I cannot hope to prove this point here. Rather, I can only say that to speak of bases and superstructures as reified collectivities distinct from their ground in human practice, or to speak of agents as only intervening in or mediating the processes by which they are produced, is a redundancy. For what else are these processes except the products of human activity? To attribute to bases and superstructures a reality of their own apart from the individuals and classes whose product they are is to fall prey to what Marx himself described as fetishism, namely, mistaking a relationship between human agents for a raya. Marx's base and superstructure 953 relationship between things, or, to put it another way, it is to commit the same fallacy as the notice in the sideshow at the fair described by Swift advertising the largest elephant in the world except himself to be seen here. SSQ.